is Chapter 4, Carbohydrates, Plant-Derived Energy, Nutrients, and the follow-up in-depth on diabetes. So the first thing that we're going to talk about in Chapter 4 are what exactly are carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are one of the three main groups of macronutrients that we mentioned previously. Carbohydrates are going to be a very important energy source, especially for nerve cells which are found in the brain. The term carbohydrate translates to carbon that has hydrogen attached to it. So what we're going to see here, the atoms are going to be made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And these are plant-based for the most part. We're going to see that good sources of carbohydrates are going to be fruits and vegetables. Now, where carbohydrates come from, carbohydrates are produced by plants during the process of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis, kind of briefly shown here, is the process by which plants can take energy from the sun. They can use photosynthesis to convert that sun energy along with oxygen, along with carbon dioxide rather, and they can produce sugars or glucose and other carbohydrates and then release oxygen. What we're going to look through when we go through this are some of the different kinds of carbohydrates. We're going to see there are a few different kinds of what are called monosaccharides, disaccharides, and then polysaccharides. And we'll look at how these are structurally different. So the first group that we're going to look at are the monosaccharides. Now we see mono means one. So these are considered simple carbohydrates. The monosaccharides contain one molecule. The three kinds are glucose, fructose, and galactose. They're taking a look at these atomic organizations. Here we see our carbon, hydrogens, and oxygen-hydrogen groups. These OH groups are hydroxyl groups. So here is glucose. Fructose, you'll notice, is slightly different. Glucose has this six-membered ring, whereas fructose has only a five-membered ring. We also have galactose, also with a six-membered ring. However, there's some differences between galactose and glucose. You can see that the organization or the orientation of the bonds is slightly different. Now, there are other monosaccharides that are not considered to be important in terms of nutrition. So there's things like ribose and deoxyribose. Deoxyribose and ribose are five-membered or pentose sugars, kind of like fructose is. They are found in things like DNA and RNA, or nucleic acids. Now, the other kind of simple carbohydrate are disaccharides. Disaccharides, di meaning two. These contain two molecules. They are two monosaccharides joined together. You may have heard of lactose before. Lactose, or milk sugar, is found in milk that we drink and in breast milk and in other sources as well. It is a glucose and a galactose molecule bound together, giving us the disaccharide of lactose. If we have two glucose molecules bound together, we get maltose. Maltose is actually very important when we look at the breakdown of starch. We'll see that maltose is the disaccharide that is created. Then we have sucrose. Sucrose is what you would find in most of the sugars that we would consume in the sugar form, so table sugar, sugar cane, honey. And what sucrose is, it is a glucose bound to a fructose. Right? So these are our disaccharides, two of the monosaccharides put together. Complex carbohydrates, therefore, are more complex molecules. So here we see long chains of glucose molecules. The way they are organized is slightly different. These are also referred to as polysaccharides, with the prefix poly meaning multiple. The one that we will focus on is starch. Starch is the storage form of glucose that you would find in things like grains, legumes, tubers, any of the plant products. There are different forms of starch. There is something called amylose. There's also amylopectin, depending on the complexity. So each of these little green areas here represents a glucose molecule. The cells that we have in our body cannot use these complex polysaccharides, so they need to be broken down, and that's the process of digestion, which we'll talk about next. Another form of stored carbohydrate is glycogen, and this is how animals store glucose, and we are considered animals. So when we have excess glucose, this is how our body is going to store it in the form of glycogen. Now, for the most part, glycogen is in very, very, very low amounts, even when we eat animal products. When we eat animal products, we're not taking in very much carbohydrate at all. We're taking in mostly proteins and fats, which we'll talk about in the later 2 chapters. So this is not a big part of our dietary intake, so it's not really considered a source of dietary carbohydrate. This, however, is a storage form, so we will talk about glycogen when we talk about our bodies and how our bodies store carbohydrates. Now, the last kind is fiber, and you've probably heard about fiber if you watch television or read newspapers. You heard something about fiber. There are different kinds of fiber. What fiber is basically parts or organizations or stored ways that carbohydrates are stored, usually in plant sources. One part is called dietary fiber. Dietary fiber are the non-digestible parts of the plant. These are the parts of the plant that when you consume them, you may mechanically break them down into smaller pieces, but we cannot digest them. We lack the enzymes to break dietary fiber down. Now, there's also something called functional fiber. Now, this is a type of carbohydrate, a type of fiber that has some sort of known health benefit. Functional fiber would be things that would be added in terms of fiber supplements. If you see something that has fiber added to it or it's fiber fortified, if you've heard of things like Metamucil, which are things that you can take that's a fiber supplement, that would be psyllium fiber. There's also cellulose and with something called guar gum and pectin. These are all different kinds of functional fiber. Now, the total fiber in a food source would be the dietary and the functional fiber combined. And if you look at the organization, we see a much tighter organization, and this is because it's coming from most of the support structures in plants, in their leaves and stems. There's also 2 different kinds of dietary fiber. There is what's called soluble and insoluble fiber, and this has to do more with basically the chemistry or the organization of the fiber. So soluble fiber is soluble. It can dissolve in water, which means it can be digested by bacteria in the colon. Now, we human cells cannot digest this, but we utilize bacteria within our bodies that help to break down this soluble type of fiber. There has been association between this kind of soluble fiber with reduced risks of cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, because they actually helps to lower blood cholesterol and also glucose levels. And we'll take a look at that a little bit later when we look at digestion. Some of the types of soluble fibers include things like pectins and gums. So if you happen to make jams or jellies, you probably have to add pectin. Pectin is a type of soluble fiber. It's made of a few different kinds of the monosaccharides. These are found in the cell walls of many fruits and berries, and those pectins can be used to thicken foods. Now, insoluble fibers, these cannot be dissolved in water. These are found in our whole grains, in the husks of vegetables, in the husks of grains, and in many vegetables. These are things that cannot be broken down. However, the passage through the body and through the colon is actually pretty important. It helps to give regular bowel movements. It also helps to alleviate constipation and reduce the risk for something called diverticulosis. Right? Now, when we take a look at the colon is really the last step on the digestive pathway. Diverticulosis is a problem that can occur where there are these little pockets on the colon. These are called diverticula. Diverticulosis occurs when there is small amounts of certain foods that are not well digested. They get into these little pockets and they can lead to inflammation, and it's quite painful. You should check out the animation that's both on Mastering Nutrition, or it's also been posted in Blackboard looking at diverticulosis. Now, we're going through and talking about carbohydrates because we need carbohydrates. One of the main reasons we need carbohydrates is for energy. Carbohydrates provide the energy to fuel our daily activity. They can also be stored as a fuel reserve. Using and burning carbohydrates as energy helps to preserve protein and allow our proteins to be used for important body and metabolic processes. In addition, the sources that give us carbohydrates also give us fiber, and fiber does a lot of things for health, including reducing the risk of obesity. Now, to review from one of the previous chapters, remember that each gram of carbohydrate has 4 kilocalories, right, or 4 calories per gram. Red blood cells and neurons in the brain rely specifically on glucose, one of the monosaccharides, for their energy supply. Now, when you're going about and doing physical activity, both carbohydrates and fat can supply energy for activities, but it's easier, if you will, for glucose to be used. It's more of a one-step process. So during intense exercise, carbohydrates will supply 2/3 or more of the total energy needed. Now, if we are using carbohydrates as an energy source, we have to have sufficient intake in those carbohydrates. If we do not, if someone is not taking enough carbohydrates, okay, what can happen is the production of something called ketones. Ketones can act as an alternate energy source, especially for the brain. Ketones, however, are acidic in nature. That acidity can lead to a change in the blood acidity level, right? And you do not want your blood's pH, or acidity, basicity level, to change too much. So too many ketones can lead to what's called ketoacidosis. Now, in most of us, ketoacidosis isn't problematic. It is very problematic in people who are diabetes, and in the in-depth towards the end of this chapter, we'll look a little bit at diabetes. Some of you may remember from a few years ago when the Atkins diet was very popular. The Atkins diet was a diet that pushed a complete lack of carbohydrates in the diet. It was a high protein, high fat, nearly zero carbohydrate diet. And one of the common problems with people who were on the Atkins diet was some people wound up getting ketoacidosis, right? And it led to damage of body tissues. So there's another reason that carbohydrates are important. The sources of carbohydrates may also contain fiber. Now, please understand, there are carbohydrate sources that do not have fiber. So something like table sugar. Table sugar is a refined source of simple carbohydrate, the disaccharide sucrose. So there's no fiber in it. So not all carbohydrate sources have fiber. However, fiber is important in most other carbohydrate sources. And fiber is very important. It has a slew of things that it has been associated with, including reducing the risk of colon cancer, reducing the risk of heart disease, enhancing weight loss, both by helping stimulate digestion and suppressing appetite. It can help to prevent things like constipation, diverticulosis. It also may have an effect on decreasing blood cholesterol levels. And so let's just take a look at that quickly. So here is our liver. One of the jobs that the liver does is it produces bile. Bile is then released into the small intestine. What the bile is going to do, bile is important in breaking down fat. So you might wonder how is fiber and fat related. If an individual is consuming a high fiber diet, as the food passes through the small intestine with a good amount of fiber, that fiber is going to bind to the bile, and it's going to pull that bile out, right, and pass it through the colon in a bound form. What that means is some of the bile has a cholesterol still associated with it. So that's going to pass out of the body without that cholesterol being taken in. So some of the cholesterol that's being brought into the body is going to be expelled out. Also, the bile itself is made from cholesterol. Interestingly enough, bile is made of cholesterol. So if the bile is not being broken down because it's being bound up by the fiber, there may be less cholesterol. Individuals who have a low fiber diet, there will be more bile that's going to be excreted, and so more bile is going to be able to be reabsorbed from more cholesterol is going to be able to be reabsorbed from the bile, and there may be an elevation in blood cholesterol levels. So just another kind of extension of how fiber can affect things like blood cholesterol levels. Let's take a few moments now and just trace the path of digestion of carbohydrates. There are two very nice animations, one that is carbohydrate digestion and the other carbohydrate absorption. Both are available in Mastering Nutrition or have also been posted on Blackboard. So this process begins in the mouth. When you eat something that is carbohydrate in nature, there is an enzyme called salivary amylase. Right? Ending in ASC means that it's an enzyme. Salivary amylase is located within the saliva. This is going to begin the process of breaking down starches, those complex polysaccharides, into maltose. Remember, maltose is a disaccharide made of two glucose molecules bound together. So as we're chewing, the chewing leads to the secretion of saliva from the salivary glands, which is just chock full of salivary amylase. That's going to break these polysaccharides into smaller polysaccharides and maltose. Now as this passes down through the esophagus and into the stomach, right, here's where we basically see a halt of carbohydrate digestion. Not much carbohydrate digestion occurs within the stomach. One of the reasons for that is the enzyme, the salivary amylase, is destroyed by the acids in the stomach. What happens in the stomach, we're going to see when we look at proteins and fats, is going to be more dealing with breakdown of those and mechanical breakdown. Now the digestion of carbohydrates then continues and is most prevalent in the small intestine. So as the food passes into the small intestine, we'll see something called pancreatic amylase. This pancreatic amylase is produced by the pancreas and it's secreted into the small intestine. The pancreatic amylase is going to break down any remaining starch into maltose. So now we have that starch being broken down into these disaccharides, 2 glucose molecules held together. From there are additional enzymes that will be secreted by the mucosal cells in the small intestine to break down disaccharides into monosaccharides. So each of these are specific depending on the type of disaccharide that may be present. So maltase, the enzyme maltase, breaks down maltose. Right? It will break down maltose into 2 glucose molecules. We also have sucrase and lactase. These are the enzymes that break down sucrose and lactose, respectively. Right? So sucrose would be broken down into glucose and fructose. Lactose would be broken down into glucose and galactose. Once these disaccharides are broken down into the monosaccharide form, they can be absorbed into the cells that line the small intestine and enter the bloodstream. If you remember from the previous chapter, the small intestine has a huge amount of folding involved in it, a huge surface area for absorption. So here the monosaccharides can be absorbed and enter the bloodstream. Now most of the monosaccharides can be converted to glucose in the liver, so the galactose and fructose make their way to the liver where they're converted to glucose because glucose is what is needed by the cells. Glucose is what is needed by the blood cells, by the brain cells. So the glucose that is released by the liver will travel in the bloodstream. Now, if there's excess glucose, that excess glucose may be converted into glycogen. So glycogen was a stored form of polysaccharide that would be stored in the liver and the muscles. Now some carbohydrates are going to pass into the large intestine undigested. Within our colon, within our large intestine, we do have bacteria. Bacteria can continue to digest carbohydrates by fermentation. Fermentation is the process of breaking down carbohydrates. Whatever's left and any of the remaining fiber would be excreted in the feces. So this just gives us those steps together. I had broken them up step by step so you can see the path of carbohydrate digestion. Now in terms of the storage of glycogen, here we look at the small intestine. The dietary carbohydrates from the stomach come to the small intestine. Here's where we have those different enzymes, the maltase, sucrase, lactase, breaking those down into monosaccharides. The monosaccharides then travel to the liver. Here within the liver, those monosaccharides are converted to glucose. That glucose can be transported out to the bloodstream for the brain and body cells, or transported to the muscle for direct use. We also can see if there's excess glucose that's being converted to glycogen here and stored in the liver, or converted to glycogen and stored in the muscle tissue. So this is basically the use pathway and the storage pathway. Now we do not, as humans, we do not have the enzymes to break down most fiber. However, some of the fiber can be broken down by bacteria that live in our intestines. So here is an example of bacteria that are not only good for us, but they're actually really necessary. Any of the fiber that is completely undigestible is eliminated with the feces, and this is something that can be apparent if you consume certain plant products. When your body digests them, they come out looking the way they pretty much went in. One great example of that is corn, if you eat corn. Now, when we have this breakdown of carbohydrates, the glucose is going into the bloodstream. So here it becomes very important, the idea of the regulation of blood glucose. Now, there's a great animation. It is available both in the Mastering Nutrition, or I've also posted on a Blackboard, looking at how blood glucose is going to be regulated. So the two main things that are going to do this are two hormones. Please remember that hormones are chemicals that are produced somewhere in the body and are sent out into the blood, and they circulate and they have various effects throughout the body. So the two big hormones we're going to talk about here are insulin and glucagon. Insulin and glucagon kind of work in opposition to one another. They are both secreted by the pancreas. Insulin, however, functions to transport glucose from the blood into the cells. So what it actually does is it has an effect on the cells. Glucose itself is too big to enter into cells, right? Cells have plasma membranes, glucose can't pass into it. What insulin does, insulin can stimulate special molecules located in the cell membranes to take glucose and transport glucose in, right? So it's kind of acting like a key to open these doors to let glucose into cells. In addition, insulin is also going to stimulate the liver and muscles to take that glucose and convert it to glycogen. So if you have high blood glucose levels, insulin gets released and it takes that glucose out of the blood and either puts it into use in the cells or it puts it into storage. Now, glucagon, on the other hand, is also secreted by the pancreas. However, this is going to be in response to low blood glucose levels. In response to low blood glucose levels, glucagon can help to break down glycogen to make glucose available. So if there's low blood glucose, the glucagon will take the glycogen that's in storage and will help that to get broken down into glucose so the glucose can be put in to bring blood levels back up. In addition, it can stimulate something called gluconeogenesis. Genesis is the creation of, neo means new, and glucose. So the creation of new glucose. Now, interestingly enough, we can produce glucose from amino acids. Amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. Now, gluconeogenesis is great. However, where are these amino acids coming from? Some could be coming from the diet. For example, if somebody was on something like an Atkins diet where they're taking in no or very, very low carbohydrates and only proteins, the whole gamut with the Atkins diet was that the amino acids that are taken in can be converted into glucose, to this gluconeogenesis. But it can be very costly as well, simply because sometimes these amino acids, rather than coming from dietary sources, they're coming from proteins we already have in our body. And proteins in the body are important for our structure. They're also important for our function. So using up proteins that we have can be problematic. So here, this is just showing you visually. Here's the pancreas secreting the insulin. The insulin is going to help to open what's called a glucose transporter. This is in the plasma membrane of cells. This glucose transporter allows glucose to enter the cell. Glucagon, on the other hand, this is going to be more important in going to liver cells. Right? It is going to stimulate the breakdown of glycogen into glucose. This is then released and it exits and it brings blood glucose level back up. So when we look at blood glucose, there are some very important interactions here between insulin and glucagon, but they're not the only hormones that play a role. There are other hormones that can have an effect as well. Two of the big ones are epinephrine and norepinephrine. Epinephrine and norepinephrine are usually released by the adrenal glands during times of stress. So these are part of your fight or flight response. And what these stimulate glycogen breakdown and gluconeogenesis, basically getting your body ready to have a massive fuel source available so you can run away during that. Cortisol and growth hormones can also have an effect on the blood glucose, bringing blood glucose level up. Cortisol is more involved in long-term stress. What happens is the cortisol and growth hormone can decrease the cells in your body cells, from utilizing glucose and taking glucose up, and thereby preserving any of the glucose that's within your blood for use by the brain. Now, in terms of blood glucose, the foods that we eat have an effect on blood glucose, and there's a way to measure how much of an effect a particular food will have. It's something called the glycemic index. Now, the glycemic index is a measure of the food's ability to raise blood glucose level compared to glucose. So there are some foods that have what's called a low glycemic index, and these cause a very mild fluctuation in glucose level. People who are diabetic really need to pay attention to things like the glycemic index, and sometimes the glycemic index is a bit confusing. It's not necessarily a measure of how much sugar is in a food, right? By means of sugar, I mean the refined type of disaccharide sucrose. So let's just take a look at a few different foods. So this would be glucose. So obviously glucose is considered to be 100 in terms of the glycemic index. But some of the things that have highest glycemic indices are things like instant mashed potatoes and Rice Krispies. Now, both of these are not terribly sweet. If you've eaten Rice Krispies without putting any sugar on them, they have very low added sugar. So please understand that glycemic index does not equal sugar content. Some things that have very low glycemic index tend to be things that are higher in fiber and relatively more natural. So things like apples and oranges and kidney beans. Now, in your book, they also go into what's called glycemic load. And glycemic load isn't just a measure of how much the blood sugar changes upon eating. It also is per unit, or per measurement, per ounce. So things like carrots technically have a very high glycemic index, but the amount of carbohydrate in carrots is actually quite low, so their glycemic load is pretty low. So all of this together should have you thinking, how much carbohydrate should I be taking in? So taking a quick look at the RDA, remember the RDA is the recommended dietary allowance. For adults or 19 or older is 130 grams per day. Now that is the minimum. So that is just supplying the brain with glucose. According to the AMDR, about 45 to 65% of the caloric intake should come from carbohydrates. And remember, the AMDR is the acceptable macronutrient distribution range. And one of the recommendations, the guidelines for Americans, is to focus on foods that are high in fiber and low in added sugars. Now notice it says low in added sugars. It doesn't say no sugar ever added in. But if you focus on foods that are higher in fiber, lower in added sugars, we're talking about foods that are maybe more natural. And in terms of natural, I mean less processed. So an apple as opposed to apple juice. As Americans, we tend to have a very high sugar diet, and sugars are usually added to food during processing or preparation. If you look at applesauce is a huge culprit. Most applesauce has a huge amount of sugar added to it. However, if any of you have ever made your own applesauce, you can make applesauce with no additional sugar to it. The reason that sugars are sometimes added during processing is because during the processing, the high amount of heats and things that have to be added, the flavor gets lost. Now, a lot of carbohydrate in terms of added sugar comes in drinks. It comes in things that have what are considered empty calories, things like cookies, candies, fruit drinks. But there are a lot of other sources that are more unexpected added sugar, things that have added sugar added back into them. Now, added sugars are not any different than naturally occurring sugars, but they have overall fewer nutrient or lower nutrient density in foods that have lots of added sugars. So they have higher calories with less overall good nutrients. Now, you've probably all heard about different things that are associated with eating too much sugar. Some of these are true, some of these aren't. So there are definitely associations between dental problems and tooth decay. One of the reasons for this is the bacteria within your mouths that lead to tooth decay. Those are going to be using sugar, breaking sugar down, and creating acids. Those acids then can wear away the enamel of your teeth, leading to tooth decay. Now, in terms of sugar leading to things like hyperactivity in children, there really have been no good studies linking hyperactivity to sugar intakes. However, there definitely have not been very good long-term effect studies, and we'll talk about some of the other reasons why too much sugar is probably not good for children, mostly having to do with childhood obesity. There are very good associations between sugar intake and increasing levels of the bad cholesterols. Those bad cholesterols are the LDLs, or the low-density lipoproteins, and we'll see those in the next chapter. And then decreased amounts of the good cholesterols, and there are good cholesterols. Those are called the high-density lipoproteins, or the HDLs. diabetes is actually not linked to sugar intake. However, diabetes is linked to obesity, and obesity is linked to too much sugar. So there's a kind of two-step causality there. One of the big problems with eating a diet that is very high in added sugar is it's also high in calories, but low in fiber. Right? And most Americans eat too much sugar and not enough fiber. Right? So the adequate intake, the AI of fiber, is 14 grams per 1,000 kilocalories. Right? And the basics, now that's not a normal diet, is 1,000 kilocalories. Females are supposed to have approximately 2,000, just around a little less than 2,000, 1,800 kilocalories. Men between 2,000 and 2,500. So that means that women should be taking in about 25 grams of fiber, and men should be taking in about 38 grams of fiber. Right? And most Americans probably don't come even close to taking that amount in per day. Just taking a quick look at some of the sources of fiber, one of the worst sources or that lacks fiber are things like white bread. White bread has very, very low fiber. So one of the easiest ways to bump up your fiber intake is just to switch from white bread to wheat bread. Another thing, lettuce. Salads are good for you, but salads that are iceberg lettuce are pretty low. So switching from something like an iceberg lettuce salad to a broccoli, right, broccoli cooked or raw, right, you could nearly double your fiber intake just on that. So just making not better, but different food choices. Now, as we're talking about carbohydrates, this is going to bring up the idea of sweeteners, because carbohydrates are sweet. The sugars that we consume are sweet, and humans tend to like sweet foods. So we have different kinds of sugars, different kinds of sweeteners. We have the nutritive sweeteners, right? Nutritive sweeteners are any of the sweeteners that contain the same kinds of sugars that we would see that we would call sucrose, right? So sucrose is our table sugar. Fructose is going to be that's usually produced by plants. It's considered a plant sugar. And then things like honey and brown sugar, right? And if you take a look at honey and brown sugar and you want to compare them, one of the discussions boards that you're going to do for this week is to compare these honey and brown sugar. Some people think that honey, brown sugar, sugar in the raw are somehow better for you than sucrose. However, they all contain 4 kilocalories per energy per gram. Right? So one of the discussions that you'll do this week is the nutrition myth or fact box on page 111, and you'll see that posted in Blackboard. The other types of sweeteners are what are called sugar alcohols. Sugar alcohols contain a bit less. They contain 2 to 3 kilocalories of energy per gram. However, they are up to several hundred times sweeter than sucrose, so they can be used in much, much, much lower levels. These are considered also nutritive, but they're sugar alcohols. Some of the names that you might have seen on these are mannitol, sorbitol, xylitol. Now, these are helpful in reducing the amount of glycemic response, and they're also used in things like sugar-free gum. Sugar-free gum actually has been shown to prevent certain kinds of dental caries when it has xylitol in it. However, you have to be careful when consuming sugar alcohols. One of the sugar alcohols called mannitol, sorbitol, things like this. Here's one of the issues with them. These are not completely absorbed in the small intestine, so they can move into the colon. When these sugar alcohols move into the colon, they can attract water. When they attract water, they can also pull in huge amounts of water, leading to a very liquid stool, also known as massive diarrhea. And there are quite a few things going around on the internet that you can see that talk about these sugar alcohols. Now, we also have the alternative sweeteners, or the non-nutritive sweeteners. These provide little or no energy, and these are used to sweeten foods without the caloric intake. So the main ones that you've probably seen are Equal. Equal is aspartame, that is the little blue packet. Sucralose, that is the yellow packet. Splenda. Saccharin, that is the pink packet, or Sweet and Low. For a long time, Sweet and Low was listed as causing cancer. That was based on some studies that were done in the 1970s, which have now been found not really to be valid. And there's a lot of information out on the internet and a lot of warnings against these kinds of alternate sweeteners. However, the FDA has looked at these quite a bit, and they have established an ADI, which is an acceptable daily intake. This is an upper level And this has been established for aspartame, sucralose. Those are the two big ones that are usually common. So here's just an example. This shows the amount of food that either a child, a 50-pound child, or a 150-pound adult would have to consume each day to exceed the ADI for aspartame. Remember, ADI is the safe level, the acceptable daily intake. It's actually got a huge amount of safety built into it. So a 50-pound child would have to drink 7 12-ounce carbonated soft drinks. Right? So if a child was drinking 7 12-ounce Diet Cokes a day, that child would be at risk of exceeding the ADI for aspartame. For an adult, a 150-pound adult, that adult would have to drink 20 Diet Cokes a day to exceed the ADI. Right? Or, if you want to talk about just those packets of sweeteners, a child would have to eat 32 packets, and an adult would have to eat 97 packets. Now, the ADI talks about how much it is safe to eat on a daily basis for the rest of your life. So if for some reason one day you had a really crazy day and you drank 20 Diet Cokes, it would probably be okay for that one day. This has to do with how much is safe to take in, how much is acceptable to take in over the course of a lifetime.